open the Shri Research Festival with this session, which shall focus on arguably one of the most critical issues of our times, that of sustainable business and how businesses can decouple their environmental footprints with growth. For us, it is all the more important to talk about this aspect from the standpoint of India and discuss the opportunities that we can leverage going ahead. To enlighten us with her insights on the same, we are extremely humbled to be joined by the Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme, Ms. Inger Anderson.
Thank you so much, and I am very pleased to speak to you today. I send you greetings from beautiful Nairobi, Kenya, where I am speaking to you from. This is our headquarters of the United Nations Environment Programme. And I know, of course, about the Sri Ram University and of the amazing work that happens at the College of Commerce. So I am very, very pleased that you are having this festival, and I'm very grateful that you asked me to speak to you. Now, when we think about the business of sustainability and the opportunities for India, I think it's probably worthwhile just reflecting for a moment that we are coming together just as some of us at least left COP26, a COP from which we expected much. And at that summit, we were looking to nations to come together with stronger commitments to limit climate change at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And yes, we left with the final agreement to keep 1.5 alive. Promises were made on reducing coal use and ending fossil fuel subsidies. And the agreements pledged more climate finance for adaptation, an issue that is of high priority for the developing nations. And the agreement recognized the need to support those vulnerable countries that have suffered and will suffer more climate damage. We saw other promises on deforestation, on reduction of methane emissions, on mobilizing of private finance around the net zero goal. And for its part, India also pledged more ambitious goals. And they included, of course, 2030 targets for renewable energy and emissions reduction, and the net zero commitment for 2030. And all of that, it does sound good. But we at UNEP, we work on the basis of science, and so we add everything up. And when we do that, everything, all the commitments that were made, which we celebrate and salute, the world is still on a path to a temperature rise well above 2 degrees Celsius. And that will mean more of the climate impacts that we are already seeing: the floods, the fires, the storms, the inundations, the displacements, the damage to human health, and therefore also to our economies and our businesses. As the Secretary General said at one point during the COP, 1.5 is alive, but it's on life support. Now the world must almost halve greenhouse gas emissions over the next 8 years. And consider this: since Paris, we have reduced, or indicated that we were willing to reduce, by 7.5%. Now we have to halve. So we have a very serious job to do with the existing inequity that we have in the world that nevertheless remains a collective challenge. We also must not forget that even though we are in the climate crisis, we in UNEP speak of that being one of 3 planetary crises. The climate crisis, yes, but also the crisis of nature and biodiversity loss, and most certainly the crisis of pollution and waste. These 3 crises together pose a threat to human peace, stability, and our prosperity. So I've spoken a little bit about climate change. Let me talk about that other crisis: nature loss, biodiversity loss. We humans, we're very good at entrepreneurial skills. We learn things, and accordingly, we've mastered agriculture and fisheries. But that means that we've altered 75% of all land and 66% of marine environments. And that means that more than 4 million hectares of tropical forest, primary forest, which is the size of my country, Denmark, are lost every year due to agricultural expansion, livestock, etc., and infrastructure. And almost 30% of India's land area is degraded. A 2018 study concluded that degradation leads to a loss of 2.5% of India's economic output annually. And that's significant because nearly half of India's 1.3 billion citizens directly depend on agriculture and forests. In fact, approximately 20%, including indigenous communities, women and marginal farmers, are dependent on forest resources. And let's also consider this, that nature and nature's infrastructure is that which cleans and scrubs our air, keeps our cities cooler, protects our coastline when we have mangroves. So nature's infrastructure, and of course, pollinates our crops. So we need nature more than maybe we understand. So that's a nature crisis. Let me now consider a little bit pollution and waste. And I do that with a degree of humility because I speak knowing that you are sitting in New Delhi in that toxic Delhi smog. I know that schools and colleges are shut, and I understand that people are being encouraged to work from home. And that sounds like it's COVID-19 lockdown, but it's not. It's our doing. It's the poor air quality, and that air quality and that poverty of that air quality is the reality of life in more than 75% of Indian cities. This despite significant progress on clean cooking fuels, on a program to control ambient air pollution. Based on global estimates, more than 1 million deaths were attributable to air pollution in 2019. And by affecting children's health and development, air pollution frankly threatens India's future growth and development. And meanwhile, only 37% of India's urban municipal solid waste is treated. So I painted these three crises for you. So friends, what I think we can see is that we need an urgent transformation in these three areas to address our sustainable living and therefore sustainable business on this good planet. We have to tackle the Earth's environmental emergencies and human well-being as one indivisible challenge. We cannot pollute our way to wealth and clean up later. That was the trajectory that the so-called developed nations used. But we have so many people on this good planet today that it no longer computes. So we need to transform our economic and financial systems to power the shifts to sustainability. We need to transform our food systems, our water systems, our energy systems to meet growing human needs so that we can have an equitable, resilient, and environmentally safe future. Now, India can and must be a leader in these transformations. India will soon be the most populous country in the world and home to one of the youngest populations, which is where we have imaginations, innovation, and so on. India is the world's third largest energy consuming country, with 80% of the demand being met by coal, oil, and solid biomass. Despite its effort, India is predicted to be among the top 3 emitters by 2030. And millions of Indian households are set to become better off, which we applaud, of course, and therefore they will buy new appliances and air conditioning units and vehicles and so on. And rapid growth is expected in our building stock, our housing, our other infrastructure, and construction materials, which will be needed. Amid this backdrop, India has made commitments, and India is making progress. In recent years, India created a massive expansion in renewable energy. India's efforts at promoting, for example, LED lighting are a massive success story. We understand that over 360 million LED bulbs, 7 million LED tube lights, over 2 million energy efficient fans, etc., have been distributed. And this is really good. This has brought savings in power use to the individual families, thereby lowering their bills, but also, of course, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And we also have to note that India is taking steps to control plastic pollution, including bans on single-use plastics and strengthening extended producer responsibility. I speak to you from Kenya, where I think 15 years ago, single-use plastic was banned. And as you fly into Kenya, the announcement will come over the loudspeaker that if you are caught with a plastic bag in Kenya, it will be a fine of $1,000. And it is. So following through on these and learning amongst developing countries can also, and indeed can be a very good way. India is also committed to restoring 26 million hectares of degraded land by 2030. But India, like every nation, is encouraged to do more for its people and, yes, for the planet. And doing more is in the best interest of the entire nation. IEA studies show that the transition to net zero carbon can catalyze new industries, create millions of jobs, and drive trillions of dollars in economic value. And of course, the early bird gets the worm here. So moving into that market, not holding on to the steam engine of yesterdecade is the way of the future. India has done that in the digital transformation. India can very much do that in the energy transformation. A recent World Economic Forum report estimates that India's decarbonization journey represents a $15 trillion opportunity by 2070. And this journey could create as many as 50 million new jobs. With an estimated 10 million Indians having lost their jobs from the second wave of the pandemic, investing in ecosystem restoration as well as the energy transition becomes even more important for sustaining household incomes in the long run. But we often expect governments to deliver these things across the world in every society. And of course, governments have a role. They set the policy guardrails. But for this, we need a whole of society action, and a whole, because it is a whole of society problem. We need to take responsibility in every aspect of our work and our professional lives. Look, it can be difficult to make sustainable choices in a system that doesn't encourage them. It can be difficult to refuse a good paycheck on moral grounds when you need to put food on the table. But we can also look for the opportunities where we find them. We can challenge ourselves to live a more holistic life by following green principles, guiding our work and our personal lives and our choices. Now, let's look a little bit about what that means for business. That triple crisis, the crisis of climate, the crisis of nature, and the crisis of pollution and waste, is frankly a massive risk to profitability. And the reason why I'm saying this is, yes, we can sort of in the short term have a big profit in the quarterly, on a quarterly basis. And meanwhile, the proverbial forest has been cut down, or we have polluted ourselves to ill health. But actually, we need to think longer run. And obviously, sustainability in business is in everyone's best interest. Not having people work from home, but having a vibrant economy. Even putting aside the direct risk from climate change and nature loss, for example, consumers are increasingly making choices based on sustainability criteria. No business wants to stay afloat long, no business that wants to stay afloat long can afford to keep backing that status quo. So how are businesses going to go about making that transformation? The first step is to start accounting for the value of nature. The value of nature. UNEP can already estimate the value of natural capital. And in fact, Professor Partha Dasgupta has done an outstanding report at the request of the UK Her Majesty's Treasury on the economics of biodiversity. When we work with the value of natural capital, the planet's stock of renewable and non-renewable natural resources, we are encouraging governments to use that alongside produced capital and human capital, because that gives us a true inclusive measure of growth. Because what we have been doing, we have been growing on human and on produced capital, of course, but at the cost of natural capital. And that in the long run also does not compute. And businesses can take this on too and begin to understand in the long run, how is it that their profitability can be assured for their shareholders and for their owners. If a business is making money in the short term, but damaging the environment in the long term, it needs to reflect this in its balance sheet. And the government needs to set the guardrail to enable that. The next step is to set science-based targets for nature, for climate, and for pollution. Again, at the government level, yes. And this is something we are encouraging across the 193 member states. But that means adopting a time-bound plan to make operations at the company level net zero. That means adopting circular models to reduce reuse, and recycle as many resources as possible. Because look, these resources are finite: cement, metals, and it's ridiculous for us to think we take them out of the earth's belly and make them into a commodity. And then we were done with it one way or the other, it becomes landfill. That's insane. These are resources we need to think about in circularity setting. And if we do that, we can reduce the toxic trail. Now, many Indian industries have already set science-based targets based on the climate commitments. As many as 57 Indian companies have committed to more than 95 emission reduction targets, and many others have set renewable energy targets and energy efficiency targets, and 400 Indian companies are a signatory in the UN Global Compact, which is a voluntary commitment by businesses to implement the universal sustainability principles. And these companies are getting busy, but we call on all companies to join that movement. The third step is to hold suppliers and trading partners to the same standards that these companies are. We're talking about being comprehensive and holistic. A business internal operations can be squeaky clean, but if it's outsourcing the environmental damage, as many of the Western economies are doing to the third world, if that becomes part of the problem. So this is something we need to understand at the global level, but we also need to understand it on the India economy level. And so that is a conversation that we also need to have. And all of this applies not just obviously strongly to investors, to banks and insurers, because we all need to have all investments back sustainability. In our work at UNEP, we're seeing even stronger commitments on this front. More than 250 commercial banks worth $65 trillion have signed up to the UN Principles for Responsible Banking, aiming to slowly shift the investment portfolio to align their businesses with these challenges. And we at UNEP are holding them to account. Members of the UNEP convened Net Zero Banking Alliance have, since its inception in April, grown to 84 banks with about $64 trillion in total assets. That's about nearly half of the global banking assets that are available. And a longer standing group that we established in 2019 called the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance comprise investors that realize that they cannot decarbonize themselves unless the underlying industries they support also head in that direction. And that alliance now has 61 asset owners, collectively responsible for around 10 trillion in assets under management. So also working with the banking and finance sector to help shift them. There are also other undertakings that we have. We are engaged with the Net Zero Insurance Alliance that now has 13 members with around $500 billion, aiming to accelerate net transition by 2050. And we're doing similarly with the pension funds, etc. So it is about thinking about where all this money sits and how we can shift it. Crucially, all of these processes and commitments that I mentioned, they have to be very transparent because greenwashing is an ever-present danger. And we need to be very honest about that and be very clear, because greenwashing is a very cynical attempt to gain the financial benefits from the sustainability trend without actually doing the hard work, and that has to stop. And we at UNEP certainly seek to call to account on that front. So my first point was, what is it that businesses have to do in terms of shifting? But secondly, I want to talk about what students and young people, such as yourselves, who are about to start out on your careers can do and lift. Now, previous generations, and that includes me, have left youth with a legacy of environmental devastation. It's grossly unfair, but youth, as the next generation of leaders, can and frankly have to be the change makers. That is unfair too. Each one generation seeks to make this shift, and it falls to your generation to make what is probably the most important. Students entering the workplace could easily go and work for businesses that are doing things that I just outlined above. This is a valid choice. but they can also become change makers within that broken system, broken at the global level, I hasten to add. So we need brave and fearless people inside the corporate world to begin to force them to move beyond lip service to sustainability and to start doing something meaningful. Another option that is just as valuable for youth is to start your own green business. That's why in September of 2021, we launched the India Green University Network to provide higher educational institutions with a platform to collaborate across the spectrum. And the network aims to help students build green and environmental sustainability skills through education. If the old companies won't change, frankly, new ones can displace them. Young entrepreneurs can take advantage of the growing demand for green and sustainable products, services, and companies, just like you've done in the digital revolution. We are in desperate need of new ideas and innovations. And the good news is that we're seeing many youth-led innovations and startups in India. We've seen furniture from rice husk, replacement of plastic packaging with jackfruit and banana leaf for based packaging. We've seen an enormous amount of work in the electrical field. We've seen processing of natural dyes from withering flowers and much, much more. These are just a few examples, of course, but we've also seen very sophisticated investments in the engineering field. So my third point, I've spoken about what businesses can do, what young people can do. I want to make a few comments about our personal responsibility, each one of us. Because even if we green our business operation, we take up the system from within, or we come up with something revolutionary, we each have to carry the fight into our personal lives, into our family lives. We need to choose greener forms of transport, adjust our diets, cut our food waste, move away from fast fashion, buy secondhand, repair, reuse, recycle, choose green energy providers when available, and put our money to work through ethical finance. We can also choose to take direct action. For example, beach cleanups organized by Afroz Shah, who I'm sure you will know, is an environmental activist who was awarded the UN Champions of the Earth Award a couple of years ago. And his movement has grown into inspiring people across the world to clean up beaches. Indians have also pioneered community-based agriculture. Just this month, Tulsi Gowda, a 72-year-old tribal woman, was awarded India's fourth highest civilian honor for her contribution to protecting and reviving native plants in the Indian state of Karnataka. So we must always remember also that we have a vote, and we need to get on the right side of history and vote for leaders who do the right thing by the planet and so by us. Because environment is now in our boardrooms, in our classrooms, and yes, in the voting booth. So friends, we clearly have a massive challenge on our hands, one that no nation or company or investor or individual can tackle alone. But what COP26 has shown us, that the attention and the protests around it have shown, is that climate change is at the forefront of everyone's minds. People want action. They want to act themselves. And the same applies to nature loss and to pollution. If each of us does our part, we can put humanity back on track to be in harmony with nature. We can find a way to live together on a planet of peace, prosperity, and equality, and we can all be change makers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was indeed very insightful. Ms. Anderson, with your more than 30 years of experience in international development economics, environmental sustainability, strategy and operations, and having led work on a range of issues, including agriculture, environmental management, biodiversity conservation, climate change, and Italia, I believe the next segment of this discussion, the Q&A segment, will really be an insightful one.
I'd like to reiterate certain housekeeping announcements for the audience before we commence. Kindly take note that the session will be a moderated one. Henceforth, all attendees are invited to type out their questions in the Q&A section at all times in order to facilitate the discussion. Thanks once again for those enriching insights, ma'am. We believe the audience has questions to put forth. However, before we take questions from the Q&A box, we will begin with some of ours. Diving straight into pertinent questions on the topic for today, ma'am, our first question to you is, we know that almost every organization understands the importance of sustainable development, but it's, when we look at the actions of all sort of organizations, those are hard found when it comes to implementing those strategies. Why does this action gap exist? And what, according to you, can be done to eliminate this gap?
We have to think about what it is that we incentivize and how do we do it. And this is not about India, this is about the world. We have a world where we have trillions of dollars going into carbon subsidies and agricultural subsidies. And some of them are very, very important, especially to poor people. But do we need to have these subsidies blanket, or can we target them? If we target them and make them pro-poor, so that pro-poor farmer, yes, he gets a diesel subsidy for his diesel pump, but does that gas-guzzling Mercedes need a subsidy? And so target subsidies and be smart about it and use a fiscal space to invest in green, to set the guardrails. The poor cannot, globally speaking, carry the burden of this transition, but you can enable and enforce the transition by being really smart, both on agricultural subsidies, on food subsidies, which are very important for poor people, but I don't think all people need it. And this is sort of a global comment, not pertaining to India alone. I also want to stress that we invest in education because we believe that labor is a capital that is worthwhile investing in. You could argue that, well, what's the return? I don't see the return because it's not an immediate fiscal return like it is if I invest in a company. But we have decided to invest in health and education as a global world. But we're not investing in nature. Why? Because right now you're locked down in India and it makes no sense that we haven't invested in cleaner air, that we haven't invested in that transition, because the economic cost that is being paid right now by closure and asthma cases and childhood infections and what have you is very high. What we're shaving off GDP is not there. So in a sense, we privatized the good and made public on the public purse the bads, the environmental bads. That doesn't compute anymore. So we need to sort of think about how we encourage this transition so that it's fair and just and protects the poor, but also enables a transition. That is why I speak about government guardrails that have to be set in place to enable that. And of course, the biggest thing in Glasgow, and this will be my last point, was that we needed to get an agreement on what is referred to technically as Article 6, but it deals with carbon markets. Still going to be a little way before it works, but there has to be some funding that can shift and tax carbon emissions in a fair and equitable way.
Ma'am, you talked about, an ethical finance and carbon markets, right? And we as a society, we also prepared a report on this, on carbon markets and all, cap trading, if you have heard of it. So I have to ask you, what role do these novel financial instruments like green bonds, carbon markets, cap and trade schemes in ensuring that businesses keep ESG concerns at the center of their investment and growth strategy?
I think that there is a lot of noise outside. I'm sorry, I don't control it, but at any rate, carbon markets have the potential to play a big role, but right now it's a very, very fractured system, right? There are literally so many markets that are closed, the European space, the Chinese space, etc. And it means, and we've had so much leakage, and we've had so much lack of clarity on offsets, etc. But if we get carbon markets right, and there are a number of folks who in my circles who are calling on a global price, because right now, in Europe, it trades at sometimes near $100, but if Costa Rica wants to preserve a forest, it trades at $5. Now, what's with that? So we need to have a kind of, but of course, permanency is part of it. But the inequity in the fractured carbon market has essentially made it nearly impossible for poor countries to be rewarded for keeping their tropical forests standing, right? Which is in everyone's interest. Secondly, on the green bonds, a number of countries have experimented with that at the public level and put out green bonds, and it's very interesting. And we see it also at the municipal level, which is very interesting. Issuing green bonds with a maturity that has a little bit out, that will then enable that municipality or that city to make some shifts. And of course, I mean, muni bonds, we know they're quite reliable when we see them, of course, national bonds also. So I think that this is a future that whose time has come. The same we're seeing on debt swaps, green debt swaps, a number of countries that have severe indebtedness and really suffering. And they have made some deals where they have reduced the value on the dollar of the debt considerably by making some transitions that the investors know they will get more on return on than a bankrupt economy. So there are all kinds of potentials that are there, and we're seeing more and more this being picked up.
Thank you for answering that, ma'am. My next question would be, although India and China are among the world's largest CO2 emitters, the per capita emissions of these nations is still much lower than those of the United States and the European Union, etc. And this raises an interesting question, and also one of controversy, in fact, in the recently concluded COP26. Are developing nations justifiable in their demands for phasing down coal rather than phasing it out? We'd love to hear your insights.
You know, I think this is storm in a teacup about a word, and it made a lot of media splash. And okay, so we can have that discussion, but you know what? Coal days are numbered, and it's a question of how this can happen. The historical carbon trail by the wealthy countries is indisputable. And so the inequity of what is being on the table is blatantly obvious for us to see. You know, there were countries that moved early on coal and got themselves very wealthy. And now we're discovering what it's doing to our economies, to our ecologies and our planet. So that's the fact here. So I would focus less on down or out, because I think that that's neither here nor there. I do think that the fact that in the Glasgow Pact, we mentioned both phasing down and fossil fuels is significant. We've never had the word coal mentioned so directly before, so that's good. But we need to understand that Mongolia, you know, India, South Africa, countries that are 100% nearly coal dependent cannot turn on a dime. But if they don't turn, we're all doomed, right? So we just need to understand, and China obviously, we need to understand that turning will have to happen, and delaying is not going to work for the global good. The cost of the poor, on the poor in the countries I just listed will be much higher than the cost on the person living in Manhattan, although there will be a cost to the person living in Manhattan. And so I worry a little bit about that we over-focus on this down-out thing, which was neat media fodder, but frankly, it's not that significant. I do, of course, I mean, for the Pacific nations, I don't want to underestimate the Pacific nations, and 40 other countries made very strong statements about their disappointments. And they are the moral clarion call, because they are nations that will disappear. And so that matters, and matters greatly. But we have to understand that if we have to halve our carbon emissions by 2030, and considering that the developing economies have a larger carbon budget than the developed, when we add it up, right? Even if the developed made net zero tomorrow, we're not going to make it unless the developing step in. So it is a collective pact to move forward, but with the solidarity and the financing, which has not been on the table so far.
You talked about an aspect of developing nations and developed nations working together, right? And this raises a question that India wants to become a $5 billion economy soon, and the fact that it heavily relies on coal and other products for its development. So, obviously, saving an environment is one thing, but how will India then ensure this, momentum of development if it decides to let go of coal and look for alternate energy instruments, both supply-wise and cost-wise?
It's if we think, I'll mention a different country. I'll mention Morocco. Morocco is 100%, is much smaller than India, but allow me just to do this nevertheless. Morocco is 100% hydrocarbon importer. They have nothing, but they happen to be in a place with very high solar radiation and very high wind velocity. And so back 15 years ago, they said, okay, we're a poor country, we're imported. This is when oil was at its peak. And they borrowed, yes, nearly $2 billion to invest in the world's largest solar plant. Now they are exporting energy to Europe. So I think it is also, as I said, about figuring out and having consistency in the policy guardrails that the government sets to enable this. Because what you don't want to do is all of a sudden have energy shortages, which we have seen this year in a number of economies. So you want to, in my view, have a clear pro-poor subsidy regime. That's your first thing. And if you have universal personal identification, you can do this. So you set up universal, and so you have a pro-poor. Brazil did that under Lula. They had the Bolsa Familia, which allowed cash payments to the poorest against certain conditions, like the girls had to be in school, and there were certain things that had to be there, which enabled more cohesive societal development. You do these cash payments so that, and then you reduce the subsidies in the meanwhile, gently, because you don't want riots in the street. You get the fiscal space, you open up for investments for renewables, you make some incentivizing around that. And as the renewables come in, you slowly turn off the carbon tap. But you do that in a manner that is safe for a country that is so massive and so enormously important as India. You can't do it on a dime. My own little itsy bitsy country that corresponds to a tiny village in India, I'm sure, we're just 5 million people, but at the oil crisis in the 70s, we decided to invest heavily in wind. And now there are days where we're completely just running on wind. So I think, and of course, my country has decided to not exploit any of the gas resources that it has. So I think, there are ways of doing this, but it takes time.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering that. My next question would be, India being a country with a vast unorganized sector, how can the government ensure that this notion of sustainable business doesn't remain limited to only a few hand-picked corporates, but also trickles down to the informal establishments as well?
This is hard, and in a country like India, where the bulk of business is in the informal sector, it's very hard. But I think beginning in the formal sector becomes imperative, because this is where rule of law will apply to a large extent, and where taxation and regulations will be enforced. I think on the informal sector, to shift to sustainability, it means about enabling self-starters, enabling angel finances, making opening a business easier, not so much red tape, but enabling that whatever red tape is there will nudge you to the greener side. And I think that there are many ways that this can be done, but the bottom line is, and we know this, right? In India, it is about the energy, it is about the transport sector, and it is about the building sector, and it is about agricultural burning. These are the dimensions that are impacting on climate and on air health. And so finding ways within each of these sectors that you can shift will be important. So a significant part will have to be on the formal sector to begin with.
Right. So we have just one question of ours, and then we move on to the Q&A section. And this question actually is of very importance to me because I aspire to become a young entrepreneur, a startup owner. And you talked about entrepreneurship in India as well. So do you think that startups will actually play a more crucial role in this whole concept of sustainable business than the already set up big industry houses?
Oh, absolutely. I think startups, I mean, look, let's just think, who are the giants today? The Amazons and they were little garage people at one point. I mean, or Bill Gates or Apple, they're college dropouts, so don't drop out. That's not what I'm saying, but I think that it is that entrepreneurial spirit. It is that desire or that ability to see beyond the current horizon of what is, but rather into what might be. Who would have thought that this thing, when I grew up, would be a thing that could tell me everything I ever wanted to know and things I don't want to know. But at any rate, who would have thought? So it is about being visionary, and it is absolutely the change makers that shift. Ride sharing and the sharing economy, who would have thought just 10 years ago that this would be a future? So I think it is about looking at those shifts and seeing how they can be enabled. So, but of course, banking sector is generally quite conservative and will, finding investors in something new and entrepreneurial is not always easy, which is part of why we're working with the banking sector to help transit that towards sustainability.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we'll move to certain questions from the Q&A box that the audience has asked. First question is, often sustainability is associated with higher costs and thus prices. How does sustainable business remain accessible to the middle and lower income classes?
So let's take the issue of, it's correct. It's often more expensive to live sustainably. And why is that? Well, in many countries, we are subsidizing fertilizer and insecticides and pesticides, causing massive nitrogen pollution in our waterways and in our oceans. But we are not subsidizing natural farming. And yet we know that natural farming can in fact be better for the earth and better for our people and better for our health and better for the farmer. So we need to think, it's all, what is it that we are nudging ourselves towards and why? And so when we begin to engage in that conversation, we will see. Now, again, I'm sitting here in Kenya. I'm finding that more and more, because Kenya is very much leaning in on nature, after all, it's also a tourism economy for safaris, etc. So it has a certain brand to it. And you will find so many startups here and so many businesses started up by people trying to lean in on the long term and on the sustainable. And the more this is on the market and mainstreamed, obviously, the cheaper it will be. In the long run, to a large extent, we have enabled that the toxifying, the poor diet, just look at the US and see who is malnourished. It's the poorest people, right? There are people who live on the quote unquote other side of town that cannot find fresh produce, that cannot find, and yet carrots and onions are a lot cheaper than processed foods, but it's that stuff that is available. So how do we find these business opportunities, invest in them, and ensure that there can be long-term sustainability? Governments has a role to play, individuals have a role to play, education has a big role to play because it affects our choices. Will I rather eat at McDonald's or will I rather have a healthy vegetarian nice meal? So I think a global issue is one where we need to talk about education, incentives, government regulation, and of course, better awareness of the average citizen. That will help drive down the cost. If we talk about energy, of course, yes, solar, wind started out much more expensive. Now it's cheaper than coal. It's cheaper than coal. So we have to understand that also as the market broadens, as the technology gets better, we find that these things are much more competitive. So it is a question of also picking the winners, not us, but the winners in the market get picked such that they can bring down the costs.
Right. So you were mentioning about costs, and you also said that the whole concept of financing this financing all this has not been put on the table yet. And India announced the net zero target during COP26. However, there exists a huge gap in the climate finance available to meet these targets, right? So in this case, don't developed nations have the responsibility to provide this finance to developing nations? I mean, India needs over $10 billion, while COP is concluded with a mere $100 billion in climate fund.
You know, I saw this question on the screen there and I thought this is spot on. And I'm very glad that Anyanya asked this because, look, this is unconscionably unacceptable. I mean, it's complete. In 2009, we had COP15. And at that time, developed countries said, yes, by 2020, there shall be 100 billion. Now index that to inflation. Let's just talk 2009, now it's 2021. And we've only reached what? We barely scratched past 80 billion last year. It's not okay. And 100 billion, even if you index it for inflation, is by far the floor. We need trillions, as the question here highlights. Now, not all of this will be grant financed, obviously, because building new power plants doesn't come by grants, but it has to be sweet money that enables these other investments to go in. And that was a very strong view of the United Nations that unless you put, I mean, don't do a sort of repeat here of vaccine inequity, deal with the promise that there is and the moral imperative that you have to help these countries make this transition. You cannot, to a country that's sitting on a pile of hydrocarbon and nothing else, tell it not to make those shifts. But countries can also help themselves by setting the regulatory guardrails, by dealing with their subsidy reform and other issues. But it's unacceptable to the UN that this money is not on the table, and we are calling for it. And now again, you saw the Glasgow Pact, it notes with deep regret, etc., fine. But now show us the money. I mean, I'm sorry to get quite specific here, but I agree with you. And we need this money, and it has to be much more than 100 billion.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question that I can read from the chat box here is a cap and trade system justified for SMEs which cannot afford higher capital investments for greener technologies?
You know, I saw that question too, and I think, yeah, it's a very hard issue, right? Because how do you if you are just a struggling small company and then there is an additional cost to doing business. But on the other hand, if this becomes a global leveling field, so that it sort of levels the playing field, it should enable some degree of shifts. Because the alternative is a world that we are leaving to our children's children, and you actually, you know, it's your children, because a child born today, God willing, will be alive in 2100 in a 2.7 degree world. Right now, we're living in a 1.2 degree world. We don't want to get there because that world, a 2.7 degree world, is a world where hundreds of millions of people can no longer live where they're living today. It's a world of deep inequity. So I get this issue on cap and trade, but I also firmly believe that getting a global carbon market and moving towards a global price on carbon is critical for us to enable those shifts. We know that taxing pollution works. We know it works. And so we know that if there's a limit to what you can do and it gets more costly thereafter, that you have to, companies and individuals will shift behavior. In my own country, back in the 70s, when we had that so-called energy crisis, when all of a sudden, you know, everything got taxed by 25% or something like that, everybody insulated their houses, like overnight. Well, we hadn't done it before. Why? Because energy was cheap. So I think there is also, you know, the reality that we shift behavior when stuff becomes more expensive. So I think that cap and trade and all carbon markets become part of an absolutely essential solution. And that's why fixing Article 6 was so critical.
Right. So we'll just take a last question and then we'll end the session. So the tourism industry alone contributes about 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this figure is expected to grow, around 130% by 2035, sorry. Considering that the alternatives aren't as well explored in relation to that particular industry, how can this industry be amended? I mean, I know it's very industry specific, but tourism, again, contributes a lot.
No, it's a huge question, and it's a question that is discussed many places. I don't think we will not stop traveling. We will not become monks, This is not what anyone is calling for. We need vibrant economies that give jobs, that have growth, that lift people out of poverty. And tourism is one of those dimensions. But tourism itself, and the UN hosts the World Tourism Organization, UNWTO, not to be confused with the World Trade Organization. And the UNWTO, it's a World Tourism Organization, works very much on exactly how to enable operators, how to enable that industry to begin to shift. And there are many ways, and there's some really interesting one. In Indonesia, for example, where many tourists come to do diving, but the coral reefs are dying. So many of the tourism operators have clubbed together and invested in coral reef rejuvenation. Good for biodiversity, good for the oceans, good for fisheries, and good for tourism. So, and interesting enough, insurance companies are saying who are supporting and underpinning the hoteliers are willing to make some payouts towards this restoration. So I think the more we look, I know it's similarly in Egypt, where also there's a lot of tourism, there's been quite a lot of investment. So you see this, and certainly we at the UN do believe that long-term sustainable tourism will be part and parcel of the future economy. And again, I'm sitting here in beautiful Kenya, and I will tell you that this is big business here, very, very sustainable ecotourism, very big business. Tourism is, I think, the second greatest earner in this country. And people come here because of those experiences, because they can see that there's no plastic and there's no waste, that there's all these other things that people like. So I do think that this is part of the future.
Right. Surely my next visit will be to Kenya, definitely. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you for answering our questions with utmost patience, ma'am. We are immensely grateful to you for taking out time from your busy schedule to join us today. Your refined perspective exposed us to newer ideas that are pivotal to our growth as students. We are once again extremely grateful to you for gracing the event with your benign presence. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Good luck in all that you do. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you so much.